Welcome to the third and final panel of the day. My name is Alana Redfield, and I'm the Federal Policy Director at the Williams Institute. And I'm joined by an exceptional panel. I mean, everybody today has been amazing, and I'm just so honored to be here with the three people sitting at the table. I'm going to mix it up a little bit, and I'll introduce them as I ask them questions, so I can frame their expertise in their biography. But just to set the stage, this panel here is really looking at where misinformation interacts with real people's lives. And so we call it When False Information Impacts Real Lives, a Florida case study, because we're going to look at Florida. The people joining me today have all done various forms of work in Florida and have had to address misinformation and had to address anti-LGBTQ attacks in various forms. So to, I guess, remind us, I'm sure we haven't forgotten this, but in Florida, a lot is going on. So we estimate at the Williams Institute, there are at least 772,000 LGBT people, 16,200 trans youth, and 94,000 trans adults, just to give a sense for the number of people who are impacted here. And then in the state, we saw in 2022, just to start there, I'll pick a random time to start. 2022, we saw the Parental Rights and Education Bill, HB 5057, otherwise known as the Don't Say Gay Bill. We saw the Agency for Healthcare Administration put a ban on access to gender-affirming care under Medicaid. And then the boards of medicine and osteopathic medicine also put in place a ban on access to gender-affirming care for trans youth, which I believe they voted on twice, in November and in March again, or February again. So those are just a few examples, and our experts today may bear up some other ones. But what I'd like to do is talk through what that looks like for people in Florida and how the organizing, litigation, and science-based advocacy is happening to address those issues. So let me start on the far end of the table here. Nadine Smith is from Equality Florida. She's been a leader in Florida policy for 30 years. I noticed was recently honored by Time Magazine for Nadine's contributions. Equality Florida is also one of the lead organizations responding to and coordinating with community members in Florida. So Nadine, I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about the Florida landscape, the current obstacles, and the strategies that people in Florida are using to push back.
Well, I think the most important thing to convey to the audience here is that what's happening in Florida is not a Florida problem, it's a national problem. And how Florida got to be the policy dumpster fire of cruelty that it is instructive for everybody, no matter where you live. And so it has become an epicenter for the Republican attacks on democracy, abortion access, racial progress, the LGBTQ community with a particular cruel impact on trans children, their parents, and adults. So what you should know about Florida is the Republicans have had control for 30 years, nearly 30 years, of the governor's mansion and almost both chambers and even the cabinet. And so what Ron DeSantis inherited in this moment that he's decided to run against his mentor, Donald Trump, is a strategy that says he's got to usurp him to the right in order to pull the MAGA base away from Trump. So we are literally the perfect storm. We have a narcissist and a sociopath running for president, and they don't care if they burn Florida to the ground as long as they get time on right-wing platforms to raise more money. And so it is not even that these policies are popular in Florida. Most Floridians don't support, permitless, untrained, unregistered weapons available. Most Floridians don't support the all-out ban on abortion, or the 6-week ban, which is functionally no different, right? And most people they don't support these attacks on the artistry of drag. They don't support the book banning, but it doesn't matter because, and you heard in the last panel, as long as it gets them onto the platform that allows them to raise money, that is how they keep track. So one of the things in our 26 years of existence, for all but the last 2 of those years, we've been able to rely on a coalition of Democrats and reasonable, rational Republicans to hold at bay some of the worst bills. And for 25 years, they did not pass a single anti-LGBT bill through that coalition. But what it has meant to have DeSantis and Trump as Floridians running for president, it has meant that there are no moderate Republicans left. They either resign because they don't have the stomach for the blood sport that is DeSantis's politics, or they got ousted in a primary, or they have become radical converts, meaning they have bent at the knee to DeSantis and are demonstrating their loyalty to him by, essentially politically stabbing anybody they used to stand next to. So that's why that's why as you watch everything unfolding in Florida, you see this sort of cascading awfulness. Like there are no guardrails. There's no adults left in the building to say, this is too much, this is too far. I think the things that are important to remember in that is, are the limits of it. The red wave did not materialize, and many GOP consultants were speculating aloud that there was an over-reliance on the strategy that DeSantis is using, and that it has backfired. And we actually are seeing other states reject these kinds of policies. I spoke at a Equality Utah event. The day I arrived, they had a sponsor who cut and pasted Florida's Don't Say Gay, Don't Say Trans bill. By the time I was speaking the next day, Equality Utah had gotten them not only to pull the bill, the language of the bill, but the sponsors said, we don't want to follow Florida down this path. And so I hope that what Florida is becoming is not what DeSantis wants it to be, which is a testing ground for authoritarianism. But I hope what Florida is becoming is a cautionary tale of what happens when there's nobody left in the building to stop you from careening wildly off the rails. The other thing that I just want to leave everybody with is the importance of understanding that all of these attacks, whether it's whitewashing history, whether it is the attack on trans youth, whether it is the banning of books, the limiting of the ability to protest, the intimidation of voters, all of these things, all of these culture wars are set by the same ideological arsonists, right? It all flows, like the ban on trans participation in sports has as much to do with the George Floyd protests as anything else. The terror of this convulsion, this demographic convulsion that's unfolding in American society, what demographer James Johnson calls the collision of the graying of America and the browning of America. The graying of America, which is overwhelmingly white, economic inequality also means longevity for the demographic that has more privilege. And the browning of America, which means the emerging electorate is a multiracial future with no single racial group in control. And so much of what we are hearing is driven by this fear of becoming a minority in a country, whether they admit it or not, has not treated those in the minority well. And so we have this all-out effort, and everything about reproductive control and gender policing has to do with this fear of the browning of America. And the idea that they have to reassert control in schools. They have to reassert these ideas, these ideologies, has everything to do with control of people and control of roles, and believe that the only counter to the demographic forces that are ushering in this multiracial future is closing our borders to Black and brown people, continuing mass incarceration and dismantling in the workplace and in schools honest conversations about race and bias. That's why they're going after DEI. training in schools. That's why they sought a law called the Stop Woke Act, telling private business that they couldn't do DEI training either. And so we have to understand how this all flows from a fear of this multiracial future and this belief that this is their last stand, this existential fear that if they do not erase, you'll notice they stopped talking about democracy and now they want to talk about America as a republic, because they believe that the invocation of that kind of language will allow them to more speedily erode any kind of democratic guardrails that can prevent them from concentrating power into a smaller and smaller slice of the population.
Now, I know that you have been a longtime organizer. You were a national co-chair of 1993 March on Washington, and organizing has been a component of your work. Can you speak a little bit to what some of the organizing looks like or what it means to organize in Florida right now?
Well, you know, I was just talking about this earlier, like how do we tell people the truth about what's going on without completely dispiriting them, right? Because we have an obligation, and folks may know that we issued a travel advisory for Florida. And I mean it sincerely. As somebody that I grew up in Florida, my family lives in Florida. It is painful to have to say to people when they ask, is it safe to come to Florida? The answer is, it depends. And you need to know what the landscape is. And so, you know, really with a heavy heart, we put out that guide. Having said that, I do think that, you know, we have to balance some other realities. And one of them is this. I'm 57, right? I know I look good. I'm 57, which means that when I was in elementary school, Anita Bryant was on the TV, right? Horrible thing. And we, you know, the 700 Club and the PTL Club were the first places I saw drag queens or gay pride. In the background, as they were condemning, I would just turn the volume down and go, how do I get to this place called San Francisco? But we have been through a time of being called pedophiles and groomers. We have been through a time of having all of the machinery of government arrayed against us. We've been through a time of, you know, of these same attacks with fewer resources, less infrastructure, and fewer allies. And I really do believe the Streisand effect is part of what has carried us through time and time again. Like every time they attack us, they call a question that then gets answered in the public sphere, not in the way they intended. Like, would we have marriage equality all across the country had they not raced to the State House and you know, over and over again to block our path to marriage? There were a whole lot of people who never thought of themselves as politically engaged, for whom it became quite personal. And so what we are seeing in terms of organizing is we're seeing a lot of people who never thought they would have to fight for their kid to feel safe in school, would have to fight to get books like And Tango Makes Three back on the bookshelf. They're seeing a face of hatred in their community that they're starting to get over the shock of it. And now they're dealing with reality. So yes, there are people leaving the state of Florida because they're not sure they can keep their kids safe. But there's a whole lot more of us who are angry, dug in, and we're willing to fight back because Florida's worth fighting for. But we also know what's happening in Florida will quickly be exported, and it is the DeSantis plan to make what is happening in Florida the law of the land. So for us, it has been a tremendous organizing moment where we are seeing, you know, people who never showed up before. You know, more of us are showing up at city council meetings or school board meetings, and we actually have kids in the school. We're not these astroturfers that they're bringing in to fake outrage, which is why they've got a bill now saying you can challenge a book anonymously from out of state, because they really just want to eliminate the middleman, their fake astroturf folks, and just have the Heritage Foundation, you know, or whatever other right-wing think tank, just, you know, get books pulled off the shelf remotely. So it is scary, it is painful, But in the same way that, the image that I try to leave people with is of a slingshot where, they've grabbed a hold of the slingshot and every step they take backwards, they think they're dragging us backwards. When really they are creating the dynamic tension necessary that when we break their grip, we won't just come back to where we were when they began this attack. We actually have to prepare for the trajectory of springing forward faster and further than we had originally imagined.
I'll turn to you now. Dr. Meredith McNamara. McNamara is an assistant professor of pediatrics and specializes in adolescent medicine. She is part of the Yale team of interdisciplinary specialists in law, child psychology, child and adolescent psychiatry, pediatric endocrinology, and adolescent medicine, who marshal scientific and legal knowledge through evidence-based reviews to lay bare the misinformation used to justify medical bans, such as the ones in Florida. In fact, the Yale team has done an analysis of the Florida law as well as laws in Alabama and Texas. So, Dr. McNamara, you and your team have provided publications, testimony, other commentary on gender-affirming care. Can you tell us a bit about how your team first got involved and what kind of evidence you're seeing being presented, and whether it's lawmaking, policies, or in court cases?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's really lovely to be here today. I think, I'm a very early career physician and my post-training life, and I never expected that my career would be about challenging misinformation that harms adolescents. I thought I was actually going to be able to study things that make adolescents healthy. And instead, I'm just calling out the things that hurt them even more. So shout out to my friend over here who talked about how we need to emphasize positive outcomes and the joy of these experiences, because I'm worried that we're missing it. But it's on my radar. So as an adolescent medicine physician, I know all too well how teenagers are pathologized and mischaracterized and underserved and used to suit political agendas. And I see the harms of that real time in my clinical practice every day. And we also see it on the population level. So a little over a year ago, I, along with a couple of my colleagues, had a watershed moment where I read Ken Paxton's opinion calling gender-affirming care child abuse. And I looked at the things that he had sourced. I looked at the language that he'd used and the assertions that he had made. And at first, I had a very kind of like naive perspective. And I thought, oh, God, that's not what I thought it was. I didn't know that. How can the Attorney General of Texas just be making up scientific falsehoods? Okay, I don't question that anymore. We're talking about maybe like 20 minutes of disbelief, me last year. But since then, I have realized that the misuse and abuse of scientific research and evidence is probably the clearest and most present danger to the well-being of my patients. We're seeing this, we've talked about this, right? It's not just in gender-affirming care. It's showing up in the mifepristone ban in Braidwood versus Becerra, where a federal judge decided that if you maybe kind of believe that PrEP leads to certain types of human behaviors, then you don't have to pay for it because maybe that harms your religious beliefs. Embedded in something so overly simplistic are so many scientific falsehoods that are easily disproven with really good, sound literature. But the thing is, healthcare and medicine and the law and policy really live in very siloed spaces, and we don't crosstalk and we don't share a common language. So I've had really long, and Omar probably knows this better than most people here know, but I think this was able to happen because there was nobody in the policy world creating standards for integrity and saying, you can't just make up lies in the law. You can't manufacture and distort clinical research to accomplish a political agenda if it can be proven false. So what I have learned through observing the way that transgender youth are targeted is a disinformation playbook. Which this is like kind of the imagery that's helped me with about maybe 5 chapters. You can reduce any bad claim to something that lives in one of these chapters. So chapter 1, deny the fact that the condition for which care is being sought exists. So social contagion, that basically says gender dysphoria doesn't exist. Unwanted pregnancy, that doesn't exist either. Unsafe pregnancy, that doesn't exist. HIV, it's not really a public health concern. Evidence by, omission is another way to deny something exists. There are lots of other things that fall under that category. The idea that co-occurring mental health disorders are responsible for gender dysphoria. The idea that talk therapy alone is something that should be able to help trans youth. You can really distill all of this to that one chapter. But then chapter 2 would be make false claims about the standard of care and standard practices. So, you see really egregious versions of this, like, children are being operated on and given medical treatment. That's just not true. It's not happening. So distorting the standard of care, or, this medicalized conveyor belt that if you get on it, you're not going to be able to stop. Doesn't matter whether or not you want to get off of it. No one's going to let you, and so on. So chapter 3 is to make false claims about the safety of these treatments. Those are also pretty easily proven false. People say things like puberty blockers lead to brain swelling. Well, okay, there are 5 case reports that show that pseudotumor cerebri, which is an excessive manufacture of cerebral spinal fluid, can happen with puberty blockers. 5 that are documented in the whole 3 decades of use of that medication, false claims about safety. It's easy to knock those down, right? But then we get into chapter 4, which is the worst one and the one that really drives me nuts, which is false claims about the evidence. And this is where you get all these really persuasive pseudoscientific claims. You might say, well, 80% of transgender youth desist in their gender identity. Why would we be giving them medical treatments? 80%. And then they might include 2 citations. But where are those citations from? Well, they're from about 20 years ago, when when those studies had very different definitions of gender diversity, ones that are not accurate, like, tomboys and tomgirls and things that don't have anything to do with modern concepts of gender diversity. But this is the stuff that takes time and energy and a lot of people's mental well-being to debunk, because you have to walk in expert audiences like journalists, like policymakers, like state representatives through very complicated clinical language. I have done more just teaching and talking about clinical research than I did during my master's year when I actually got a degree in clinical research. So that's what's happening these days. And the reason why I'm here talking during the Florida panel is because that's what Florida really perfected. They did a bad job, but they, on the surface, to an inexpert or a persuadable audience, they did a
presentable job.
Oh, nobody knows this better than this guy right here next to me. They did they did what they call a modified systematic review of systematic reviews. And already everyone's eyes should be glazing over, because what does that mean? But the problem is that they made this really kind of veneered kind of scientific sort of bunch of PDF documents, threw it on their website and said, this is what the Agency for Healthcare Administration stands behind when it comes to covering medical treatments for gender dysphoria. I could spend literally all day explaining what's wrong with all of that, but I won't do that to anybody here. That sounds terrible. The problem with that is that those claims, the anti-evidence chapter, that's being perfected in state legislatures elsewhere. So you've got the state of Utah saying, we need to do our own systematic review of the evidence. What an insane exceptionalist standard to hold this particular type of healthcare to, right? I wouldn't be me if I didn't tell you what the 5th chapter is. So it's just basically outright attacks on medical authority. These are advocacy organizations. Eminence, not evidence. These organizations don't represent their members' beliefs and ideals. Kind of describing and deciphering the playbook, I think, is a good way to navigate this blitz of bizarre claims. Because I think we're all kind of struggling with that. Even those of us who are skeptical and want to kind of convince those around us of what's going on, it can be really hard. So I think it's a helpful tool.
Thank you. I think that transitions us well to our third panelist, Omar Gonzalez-Pagan, who is counsel and healthcare strategist at Lambda Legal, the oldest and largest national legal organization committed to full recognition of the civil rights of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV. I think one thing I'd like to add is that Omar is prolific. When looking at the sort of last 10 years of LGBTQ litigation, obviously Omar has been really a thought leader and has been involved in so many important cases, has a really incredible perspective on everything from marriage equality to healthcare access, I recently saw you with the New York State non-binary gender announcement, right? So every aspect of policy affecting LGBTQ people. So I have a question for you, and I recognize that you might not be able to speak directly to.
Oh, no, I'm spilling the tea. There's no confidentiality.
Oh, great.
You can go ahead.
Okay, so then my question for you is, so can you talk about the ways in which these type of bans might violate state and federal laws? But also, I imagine you might have a few other ideas you want to share.
So, and what's really concerning, and first of all, thank you for having me here, and thanks to all the panelists that have spoken on this, as well as my co-panelists, where it's hard right now out there. And what's a little bit dispiriting or disconcerting is that we were so far playing on the offensive when it came to the battle for access to healthcare. We were eliminating the remnants of categorical exclusions in private health plans and state health plans and Medicaid plans. And the Trump years really shifted our collective societal understanding and polarization in our country. It's just a reality. And the last 2 years, and Alejandra gave a little bit of a timeline on some of this, but the last 2 years have seen a proliferation of attacks. And all of a sudden, we were not fighting to eliminate remnants of discrimination in access to healthcare. We were fighting to eliminate backwards regression of all of the gains that we had made. But even when we were fighting these remnants, we had already started to see this playbook of these so-called experts. And I believe this is the problem with, there was this first panel, the conversation about nuance, and law doesn't lend itself to nuance. But the problem is that some of these scientists are not nuanced because they're not players in the field, right? And the reality is that at this point, 6 years ago, in 2017, in neighboring Arizona, the Alliance Defending Freedom had held a conference. And in it, they said, we need to create a panel of experts that we will use in transgender rights litigation. All of this dates back to that very conference. And some of the very players, the ones that authored attachments to the report in Florida, the ones that have been getting used in litigation by states in all of these other cases, or by ADF attacking affirming policies in schools and the like, they're all the same players, all going back to that moment. At the end of the day, the problem with this is that the law and policy doesn't lend itself to nuance, but what we're challenging is not nuanced, right? We're challenging categorical prohibitions on access to care. Yes, there may be debates at the margin that can or should be had, and for better or worse, I have a scientific background from college, right? I was an evolutionary biologist by training. And so to me, being able to do expert work, if you will, is a little bit of marrying my educational backgrounds. But that conversation is to be had with your medical provider. That's a conversation to be had among medical providers. It's not a conversation to be had by the state in a single categorical rule that applies writ large to everybody. And when it does so, we have been able, to a great degree, over the last few years, to show that such categorical prohibitions or policies violate our constitutional rights, particularly the rights of transgender people to access care. because they discriminate on the basis of sex, because they discriminate on the basis of transgender status. And the Affordable Care Act, for all of its flaws, I will say is the greatest civil rights achievement since the 90s. The non-discrimination provision of the Affordable Care Act has made it possible for people to access care without discrimination in this country to such an incredible degree and open doors for so many people to access care. And to the extent that any of these health plans or programs like Medicaid are federally funded, they also are constrained by that law. And so we have been able to show that in a multitude of instances, not just us at Lambda Legal, but our colleagues at the ACLU, the National Health Law Program, TILDF, NCLR, and GLAD, and the like. We have all worked to eliminate these remnants of discrimination, build a body of case law that shows that this is unlawful discrimination. Yet they still persist in doing these actions, and they're emboldened by two things. A, the political environment, and Nadine spoke very well about that in Florida, and I think it applies not just in Florida, but nationally writ large. And B, the changing reworking of the courts under the Trump administration. When you have judges that were appointed because they serve the various organizations, the Alliance Defending Freedom, that held this conference, it becomes harder terrain for us to win. Doesn't mean that we don't win, but it becomes harder. And so we are now waging these battles. The ACLU has very successfully stopped the ban in Arkansas from taking effect. Lambda Legal, along with the ACLU, were able to stop the directive from the governor in Texas from taking effect. And when the Supreme Court of Texas, the liberal bastion that is the Supreme Court of Texas, decided to narrow that injunction, we were able to bring a second case to broaden it once more and get it in place. And so we're in a place where we also need to be creative. Because of this remaking of the courts, we have also brought forth other arguments when necessary. For example, in Texas, we're not leading with this. We're in the state court and we're not leading with our constitutional arguments. We're leading with the lack of authority for the governor to do this and procedural arguments. Preview, but I think we would all argue that what the Attorney General did yesterday in Missouri similarly fails just the basic governmental test of like, this is not part of your job description. You don't get to regulate medicine. And so those are the arguments that we're making. And hopefully some of those, because they're less, if you will, ideological, may hold sway with different courts and different forums. And so we continue to wage this battle. And to a large degree, we are succeeding. But it is a lot. I've described it as playing whack-a-mole with healthcare access throughout our country and trying to get rid of barriers that keep being erected. Just to provide a little bit of context, and I laughed at some of the chapters that Meredith was laying out because they are the true chapters. And it just reminds me of the work that we do. And we try to call those things out in our work. Many of the experts that they use, and this is a small cadre of experts, again, that they use, has never treated or seen a transgender patient in their life, has never published a study or done a study in their life, have never done peer review publications. And the few that have, their letters to the editor, this is my opinion about somebody else's study, but they have not done the work. They don't work in this space. And many of them, they do so because they are ideologically opposed to this care. And they want to use their title as a doctor to undermine very clear science that shows that this is safe and effective. An enormous body of literature. And so we actually started being more aggressive about how we go about this work. In order to win those legal arguments, we thought it was important to wage a battle against the experts themselves and prevent them from coming into court and lying. And so we started filing Daubert motions, excluding their testimony. We did that first in the Adams case 6 years ago now, almost 5.5 years ago now, which was a case about restroom access in Florida. And we managed to put forth those motions. And at the end of the day, the school board didn't even present their experts because of those motions. One of their experts, Dr. Cruz, a pediatric endocrinologist in Washington University in St. Louis, who's never treated a trans patient in his life, had to admit in testimony that he said to a parent, sometimes children are put on this earth to die. These are the folks that they're dealing with, though. Those gaps are the gaps that I want the court to hear, and we need to present that to the court. And so we present that. In Florida, we just filed last Friday 9 motions to exclude expert testimony. Hopefully, Meredith will be, and the team at Yale and Southwest Texas and Alabama will be weighing in soon as well by filing an amicus. But these are the folks that we're dealing with. And so we want to be able to exclude and explain they're not looking at the right studies. They're misrepresenting the studies. They're distorting the studies, and they're not qualified to opine about it. And so we did this to great success in a case in North Carolina that we have with TILDF. Alejandra was part of that team while she was at TILDF as well. And I just want to read very briefly something that the court said there in its conclusion, because we managed to exclude most of the expert testimony and then simply prevail on summary judgment because they had no expert to rebut our evidence. The court said, plaintiffs, doctors, their experts, every major medical organization, and defendants' own third-party administrators all agree that in certain cases, gender-affirming medical and surgical care can be medically necessary to treat gender dysphoria. Defendants attempt to create scientific controversy in this uniform agreement through experts who mix their scientific analysis with hypothetical speculation and political hyperbole. Only science that is relevant, reliable, and offered by qualified experts is admissible. And the admissible portions of their testimony, even when taken in the light most favorable to the defendants, do not justify the exclusions at issue. So when we do that work, when we challenge that expertise, we can prevail. That's very different. That's easier probably in some ways to do in the courtroom than it is in public opinion, but it is still very worthwhile work to do no matter how hard it is.
Well, you just gave me hope about the rules of evidence. I had almost lost halfway through this conversation. Yeah, but this is incredible. That's a really positive thing, a note to end on. And I want to move us to the next question. And this one, maybe we're going to take it back to the more depressing side for a second, which is how are these laws and this debate and the sort of context affecting people in Florida? So, each of you has engaged in different ways, whether it's representing individuals or representing important ideas and concepts in Florida, whether it is treating people individually, perhaps not in Florida, but generally treating people who are trying to access gender affirming care, or whether it's working side by side with people and actually being a resident of Florida and navigating these experiences. So we had a study with Dr. Abby Goldberg that LGBTQ parents, about half of them said they considered moving out of Florida. And we know this is affecting non-LGBT parents of LGBT kids and, of course, LGBT individuals. So I wanted to invite the panel to share a little bit of your thoughts about this real-life impact.
It's really difficult to lose some real champions for trans youth in particular. Medical professionals who, between the implied threat to their ability to work and the closing legislative net that impedes their ability to work. Somebody earlier referenced stochastic violence, which is always a part of the authoritarian playbook. So we're seeing, healthcare providers leaving our state. We're seeing families leave our state, particularly families who have been at the forefront, the real champions for their kids, because it has made them very public and allowed them to be targeted in different ways. So it's very painful to see some of the people who've been on the very front line of children feel like they got to a place where they can't fight any longer. And that being said, uprooting, leaving your job, leaving your home is not something that's even available to everybody. So, we have to deal with the reality that for everyone who leaves, there are people who might want to leave, but financially can't. And so, so there was a while there when it felt as though the tidal wave and the relentlessness of these attacks were, I was really fearful that people were so dispirited that it was kind of doing the right wing's work for them. A lot fewer people posting on social media publicly, many more private conversations. But I will honestly say that even in the aftermath of our travel advisory and lots of conversations, there's also, I would say the resistance is growing. There are people who sort of feel like, they're throwing everything in the kitchen sink at us. So, and we're still here. And I do think that there's a, you go after pride, you go after pride by banning drag queens, and you create an environment where people are supposed to be afraid. But, I've never in my life wanted a rainbow flag on my house. And there's going to be a rainbow flag on my house. It's like, they want us not to exist. They want us to hide. If we don't hide, they want us to be fearful. And I think there's a real spirit of, what? Bring it.
Yeah.
So I do think that I don't want to downplay the environment, but I also think that Pride's probably going to feel like much more of a reflection of its origin as a moment of protest than it is just a street party because of the environment that we having to organize it.
Everybody should go to Florida for Pride this year.
Come on.
Yeah, your house?
Well, I don't live in Florida. But
Party no more's condo.
I think I agree with all of that. I would add that one of the hardest parts of the job right now is speaking to the families.
Yeah.
The real fear for their kids, the real fear for their livelihoods, the real emotion in their voices. And forgive me for being myself emotional about it. To hear somebody willing to abandon their home because of the attacks on their livelihood, their family, and who they are, that is not who we are. It hurts. It breaks my heart, and it breaks everybody else's. So we fight harder, right? We get up, we put on the bootstraps, and we continue to fight, and we find those families. It used to be that in interviewing people to represent, it would be like, hopefully there's somebody that we can do media with and share their story. That is not a consideration right now when everybody's scared to even for people to know who they are, because they could be investigated by the state in Texas. They could lose their health care elsewhere. They could be fired because they're a state employee or a university employee. And so we have to work to ensure their safety while we fight for their rights. And it is hard work. And it's creating a country where the amount of families that are considering abandoning where they live, where they raise their kids, to go elsewhere is creating that very polarization that we don't want. We're creating refugees within our own country. And that is horrible. We give asylum to people for being persecuted for the basis of their gender identity or sexual orientation in their countries. And now we have to do that in our own home. So the impacts are very real. I will add one anecdote to this. And we have our plaintiffs in Florida. The impacts about these policies are very real. August Decker one of our adult plaintiffs, he lives on less than $800 a month. He lives on disability, he's on Medicaid because of disability. That is for everything: housing, food, everything. His medication would be more than 10% of his income, monthly income, if he were not covered by Medicaid. That is not right. And it is a real barrier. Mind you that in the case challenging the Medicaid regulation, denial of coverage is tantamount to denial of care. Medicaid is for the people in very low income brackets or with disability, particularly in Florida, which has not expanded Medicaid. And so denial of coverage is denial of care. And in Texas, we represent 4 families who have been already had investigations open against them by the state, and we managed to shut those down. But one family, and all of them are proceeding under pseudonym. And I'll preface this with my own understanding and everybody's understanding, and the caveat that suicide and suicidality are incredibly complex phenomenons, and there's no one particular thing that leads one person to make that decision or down that path. That said, we shouldn't make it easier. We shouldn't be trying to make it more likely because of the policies that we enact. And one of our clients, the day after the governor issued his directive, attempted to end his life. That is the real cost of these policies. We will lose people in this battle, and that is a reality. And we need to accept that. These are not abstract problems. We need to be knowledgeable about those costs and fight like hell to prevent as much as we can of the harm that's being caused. But real people will perish because of the acts of people like DeSantis, the acts of people like Governor Abbott, and the acts of people like Libs of TikTok and Matt Walsh and whoever it is. So these fights, and not all of them, are fights that can be brought or won in the courts. These are fights that are worth fighting because the costs are very real.
So, as a physician, I have these behind closed doors conversations with people and their families, and I also become somewhat visible. And I've had parents reach out to me just for advice, for help, for support, and these conversations are miserable. They're excruciating. There's a lot of moral injury that comes along with not really being able to do something discreet that helps somebody. And I think that, I can speak on behalf of my colleagues who are dealing with that every day. We're just coming out of a pandemic, right? Like we are tired and beat down. So this, this definitely adds to that. I did some math and I calculated based on American Board of Pediatrics, kind of like workforce data, that 30% of adolescent medicine physicians face felony charges or loss of licensure for practicing evidence-based healthcare. Not just prescribing gender-affirming hormones, treatments for gender dysphoria, but also for making referrals. That extends to pediatricians too, but I got tired and I kind of like tapped out when I saw that number. So, when you start targeting physicians and healthcare providers on that level, you start to create brain drains in places in the country that aren't well served. It's looking like Oklahoma isn't going to have any adolescent health providers. I think Florida is probably going to face similar issues in the coming months or years, depending on how physicians can handle what's happening to them right now. It's public knowledge that, because I don't know, someone leaked it, that like a private citizen and an academic physician was subpoenaed by the state of Florida because I produced academic work that critiqued their policies. I will say, just to kind of like turn it to something positive though, just along the lines of what Nadine said, like the fight is so fierce. And I have the greatest job in the world because my patients are so smart and they're so cool and they know that we're fighting for them. They see it all the time. So yes, these policies are discreetly harmful. Policies in Florida harm youth in blue states, in states that have codified sanctuary protections, because we do see surges in crisis calls that kind of like map out according to when these policies are issued. However, they're calling, right? And there was no one to call years back. They're calling and they're getting help. And when they get help, they're being told that there are adults out there who see you, who protect you, who love you, who will stand by you. 10% of adolescents and young adults now identify as gender diverse. Now, these are not all youth showing up in gender clinics, demanding medical treatments. These are just youth who are kind of like challenging gender stereotypes, and they're leaning into an authentic sense of self rather than what somebody else tells them they should be. They are discreetly harmed by this legislation too, but they're growing up and they're not going anywhere. So I think that's something to be really excited about. I reflect a lot on the fact that white colonialism is kind of like the root origin of a lot of anti-LGBTQ hate going back centuries. And I just don't think that we can suppress human nature much more. So equality and diversity will break through. I firmly believe that. I am very energized by the resilience of my patients when I make a decision to do this work every day.
So now I'm wondering for next steps, do we move to Florida, all of us? Or maybe we just go for Pride and check it out?
I want to just say really super quickly, we need integrity standards in health policy. I don't know what those look like because I'm not a lawyer or a politician, but I need somebody to come up with that stuff. So like, just tell all your friends, you guys seem like a really smart and empowered group. That's so necessary.
Well, and I want to say this, from climate change denial, and even though there's a scientific consensus, they learn to produce their own sort of faux experts giving people weight. In the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter protests, where they described Black Lives Matter protests as though they were violent, crime waves. Every time we don't challenge the misinformation, no matter what doorstep it begins on or ends on, we help them sharpen the swords that they are going to at some point turn on you, whoever you are. And so, addressing this, we actually can't address it in this sort of lurching from one crisis to another. We have to actually pull it up by its root. And the anti-vax hysteria would, in many ways, is how DeSantis really got more of a runway. And they learned that you can say whatever you want and then stop measuring the harm of it and call that success. And so we won't defeat misinformation until we're ready to confront it, no matter who it is aimed at.
Great. Any other next steps? Room for optimism?
Look, I mean, at the end of the day, I do believe that as bad as everything is, I agree with Nadine and Meredith here. We also have never had courts that are friendly to us. At least, certainly not in my lifetime. And I don't believe we've ever had them in the LGBTQ rights movement since it's been known since the Stonewall era, right? They've always been conservative courts. Are they more conservative now? Probably. But we've also made incredible progress. And that's why they are so angry, because we've made incredible progress. So we'll continue to adapt and make those adjustments as we have, both on the courts, in the court of opinion, and in the policy arena. But I am optimistic we can win these battles. I just want us to be conscious that the fact that we're going to win doesn't mean that it doesn't come at incredible cost in the meantime.
I would like to open up for audience questions for this incredible panel. Anybody like to ask a question?
I'm just curious, like, what thoughts you've given to being able to increase mutual aid. I think given today there was already transit belts in Missouri getting notices that their refill hormones are not going to be refilled after the 27th. Like, people are going to need mutual aid.
Now.
Some people are going to want to leave, some people don't want to stay, but they're going to need resources. And I guess, you know, our current model isn't adapted well to providing mutual aid in that way. And I guess, like, how do we chart a path forward to incorporate that?
Well, so, you know, I practice in a very, very safe blue state. They are allocating funds right now to help families who can't afford care. But, you know, it's not nearly enough. I mean, I think these states that are enacting sanctuary protections really need to be pushed to like put some action behind that, because signing an executive order and a press op is cool, but it doesn't get people to your state for care. And then following that, we really need to do some amazing messaging that, like, you want strong, caring families to come to your state and to, you know, put down roots. But, you know, I guess, like, as a physician who, like, deals with the financial cost of this all the time and navigates around that, mutual aid just cannot be the end all be all. Like, I don't know where federal protections for this are and why we don't have them yet. I don't know why Joe Biden isn't picking up my patients in Texas and Air Force One and dropping them off at our clinic. That would be great. But, you know, I don't live in a fantasy world. I know that there's a lot.
Abbott keeps picking people up and dropping them off in the blue state. Why not him?
I got it, just pretend they're undocumented
Yeah.
and get them dropped off and we can work.
But you know, to seriously respond, I think we all have roles to play, and there's a lot to be done. And we cannot look to all of the orgs or some of the existing orgs
Right.
to do everything.
Right.
That's just the reality, right? Like, I can tell you, like, I have a litigator hat, but I get yelled at all the time by Jenny because I'm taking on too much. So I just, you know, I think this is where creativity in the organizations, if that's a vacuum that is seen, then maybe that's a vacuum that can be filled with a new type of organization or a new type of mechanism to do that. I am aware of ourselves and others trying to connect people to providers in many states and to create networks of referrals and the like. And there have been existing organizations in the past that have helped to help people cover their care. James Collins Foundation, for example, an example of that. But if that's a vacuum that exists, maybe it is something that these are new problems, and maybe there may be some new solutions beyond what already exists. I think that was one question.
Okay, so then, okay, great. So the general person in the back, would you mind? Go ahead with your question, please.
Yeah, one of the things that strikes me in all of the anti-trans legislation in the state recently, but I think it's broader than that, is the insert legislature into professional self-regulation. So we see, for example, not just criminal sanctions against medical practitioners, but also professional sanctions. And it sort of strikes me that, you know, doctor at the top of that list, what roles could associations, state medical association play aside from just putting out consensus statement? Are there lobbying activities, or are there other more direct engagement with legislatures that the professions can engage in to sort of push back against this?
Well, I will note that a lot of these organizations have stepped up in multiple ways, including advocacy at the legislative level and amicus briefs at the courts and the like. I will also tell you that a lot of them are under attack right now by some of these, both in Alabama and in Florida, for even doing that. And their First Amendment rights to association are being threatened with expansive and invasive discovery that is being sought by the state for non-parties. And Meredith spoke to a subpoena that she received as being one of those. And so they are silencing those voices, and And so at some point, what you expect is for some of them to stick by the courage of their convictions. And some of them do, and some of them can't. And, just our calls based on their own interest balancing that they do. But I am certain that a lot of them have stepped up, and I do want to call that out.
Yeah, but not enough. I mean, I think your point is an important one, particularly in a state where someone who is extraordinarily petty and vindictive,
Yes.
who publicly goes after, has removed people from office, well before Tennessee thought of it. He was removing people from office, duly elected, lawmakers or officials because they publicly dissented with him, knowing that the mechanism for reinstating them was judge in the instance where he removed a state attorney said, yeah, he's completely out of line, but I don't have the power to reinstate. Right. So in that environment, the level of vindictiveness we've seen towards Disney for simply speaking up on behalf of their employees and guests has had a real chilling effect. But at a certain point, I can empathize that nobody wants to be in the line of fire, but when you're watching kids be in the line of fire and family be in the line of fire, I think people keep thinking this will blow over this, but every single one of them would swear to you if they'd been around in Jim Crow days, boy, they would have taken a stand. They would. So I think there has to be a call to some moral courage in this moment, because one by one he'll target you. But if the entire business community was condemning this, if entire industries were stepping forward in this moment, it would have a huge impact. And if Shakespeare has taught us nothing, that kind of loyalty that is based in fear doesn't get rewarded, it just gets pushed further and further.
I just, in the medical community, I think we're very kind of like bright-eyed and forgiving, and we don't really see the bad actors that are wearing credentials and misusing them. So there really aren't very many standards for intervening in that. But I think if you were to dig deeply into licensure complaints, there would be a way to really come after people's credentials for grossly misrepresenting evidence and being bad actors. I know that we're like kind of overwhelmingly apolitical and averse to controversy with interpersonal and interprofessional relationships. And you see that play out when parents are filing medical board complaints against people in their home states, and they're just getting bounced back.
And he has weaponized state agencies, from the Board of Medicine to the Board of Education to the Department of Business Regulation to go after any venue that has drag performers. I mean, these what are supposed to be independent operating, based on their credentials and skills, have become just an extension of this political campaign.
Well, I have notes for 10 more panels, so you'll come back a bunch more times. Thank you to Omar, to Meredith, to Nadine, to Doug.